Hi, and welcome to this session on investing in systems innovation. My name's Charlie Leadbeater. I'm sitting with you in the Rockwool Foundation in Copenhagen in Denmark. I'd like to welcome you to this session. And of course, we would love it if all of you could have been with us in Copenhagen. So just to give you a little sense of that we are actually in Denmark, I'm going to light a candle, a Danish candle. I'm going to put it here behind me, and you can see my Danish flag, identifying exactly where I am. So this is the fourth session that we've run this week in this festival on systems innovation. And just to set it in context a bit, this session about investment, we're interested in systems because systems are so pervasive and so powerful. So we rely on systems the whole time for money, electricity, water, but also for education, for health, transport. And systems are both powerful and quite difficult to budge because they're so locked together often. So how you move from one system to another, a better system, whether that's an energy system or a waste system or an education system, is a really big challenge. You can change individual components, but can you change complete systems? And we at the Rockwool Foundation are particularly interested in social systems, which are big determinants of human and social well-being. So education, welfare, health, care, work, so on and so forth. And we think that many of the systems that we have face mounting challenges, new demands, but also entrenched problems to do with inequality and disadvantage, but also that there may be opportunities to create entirely new kinds of systems. So it's not just about problems and challenges, it's what are the opportunities to create new systems. And so we're interested in systems innovation because we're interested in how do you deliberately and who can deliberately set out to change a system. And so we're interested in the practical knowledge that can help people do that, undertake that deliberate change, and particularly how we can take opportunities. So this week we've been talking about some models that we've presented in our green paper, which you can download from the conference website. And I'm just going to use this overhead camera next to me to take you through one of those models very quickly to explain where investment sits in this model. So this is our retelling of a very well-known model developed by Frank Giels at Manchester University. It's called the multi-level perspective model. And it says basically that there's a macro level up here, which is to do with the landscape, the context, if you like. That's about demography, values. There's a meso level, which is about institutions, infrastructure, technology. And there's a micro level, which is where entrepreneurial ventures form and you get new kinds of lifestyles developing and new ventures. So Frank says that systems change and transition is about how these three work together, these three levels. And in our model, we talk about systems often being in a state of alignment at the beginning, then going through a period of disalignment when they're disturbed and opened up for various reasons. And then they go into a period of realignment. And this period of disalignment in the middle is when new ventures start coming up and creating alternatives to the existing system. So if you take that as the landscape, you can see that there are all sorts of opportunities for investment. So down here, you might have venture capital. You might also have philanthropic funding. You might have some aspects of social impact funding coming in. Up here, if you're trying to influence the landscape, that might be more like crowdfunding, I suppose. In here, in the middle, in the system, there's a lot of public finance and public funding, And when you're trying to dislodge an existing system or wind it down, there's the question of disinvestment. Obviously, that's a big question in energy at the moment. Disinvestment from coal and other fossil fuels is a vital complement to investment in new ways of doing things. And over here, when a new system is really developed, then you get mainstream capital markets who come in. So you could see that there's a lot of opportunities and potentially a lot of investment, but it's a question of how it's organized, perhaps. So perhaps what we need to do is think of how you might create more of a ladder of how these things come together, and you get a kind of more of a way in which these kinds of activities are layered together. So you get a sort of layered and blended kind of approach to investment across this whole landscape. What it's clear is that it's not just about venture capital. It's not just about new ventures, but it's also clear that there are lots of dilemmas in this, which is how do investors get returns, whatever those returns might be, and how do they organize the kind of collaboration that's required for this kind of change over a long period of time. So these are some of the dilemmas we're going to be talking about today. And to do that, we've assembled for you a fantastic team. But before we come to that, we want to get a quick sense of who's in the room. And so I would like to bring up, if we can, Anton, our first of two polls. I hope everyone's had an experience of using these polls. They're incredibly simple. I think we've got 5 questions in this poll. The first is, are you new today or were you here with us on previous days? We're keen to find out where you're logging in from. We've had 1,807 people sign up for this conference from 73 different countries. So we're keen to find out the spread of interest that there is across different countries where you're coming from. Question 3, do you think there's enough investment available for systems change? And if it is available, is it in the right form? That's question 3. Question 4 is, do you think existing funders should focus more on wholesale systems change, or do we need new types of fund and funding? Is there an important opportunity for innovation in funds and funding, and which types of funder do we think might play those roles? Philanthropic, venture capital, social investment, public, mainstream financial capital. So I'm just going to give you another 15 seconds just to answer the questions in that poll, and then we'll go back and reveal the answers. So we've got 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we'll close the poll now. And there are the answers. So there are quite a few people, 80% of people actually had been to another session. So there's 20% new today. A large contingent from Denmark and Europe, some from East Asia and Australasia. Do you think there's enough investment for systems change? A majority say no, and almost the same proportion think yes, but not in its current form. So there might be resources, but it's not available in its current form. A small majority think that it would be a good idea for existing funders to shift their focus. And almost as many people think that really significant innovation is needed. And interestingly, 81% think that the leading role in this kind of systems change investment should be taken by the government and the public sector. So we'll come back to some polling questions at the end to try and sum up our discussion. I just want to explain a little bit about how you can interact with us and the speakers. This is not a Zoom meeting, it's a webinar, and in Zoom meetings, people use the chat. In webinars, it's the Q&A button, and the Q&A button allows you all sorts of functionality, which my colleague Jenny Winhall is going to explain, because she's looking after that aspect of this webinar.
Thanks, Charlie. So yes, I will be doing my best to track the comments and questions that you're posting in the Q&A. And to start us off, let's put a question in there just now. So let's have, what are the biggest challenges getting funders interested in systems-wide change? So what are the biggest challenges that you from your experience, see with that? You might be a funder yourself, in which case, what are the barriers that you face? And you can comment on that question, and you can also post new questions in the Q&A as well. And you can upvote the questions or the comments that you think are particularly relevant. So I'll be tracking that throughout the session, and make sure that we bring some of those in towards the end. Thank you.
So yeah, do keep your questions coming throughout the session, because we'll come back to all of those at the end. We're lucky to be joined by a fantastic graphic recorder, Carlotta, who is not with us, is actually over the bridge in Sweden. And we won't see Carlotta, but we will see her work. So she's going to be keeping a graphic record of our discussion, and we'll come back to this at various points in the session. And at the end, we'll create a digital version of this, which we will send to you tomorrow with an email with various other follow-ups. And of course, if you want to contribute through social media, we're sharing in the chat, we're sharing the social media hashtags for people to use. So without further ado, let's introduce our speakers and contributors. And we're lucky to be joined from Bangkok, from the UNDP in Bangkok, Giulio Quaggiotto, who is a senior figure in innovation in UNDP and leading efforts to try and get funders to take systems innovation seriously. We're joined by Alex Sutton, who's a grant manager from the Paul Hamlyn Foundation in London. And Alex runs a fund called the Shared Ground Fund and a range of initiatives around migration into the UK to try and shift the migration system. And Alex is going to talk about, in practice, what a funder is doing to try and shift the system. And one of the people that Alex has funded is Chrisann Jarrett, who is a system shifter, who has created two organizations, Let Us Learn, and then out of that, We Belong. And Chrisann is actively engaged in trying to shift the migration system. And she's going to talk to us from the point of view of someone who has been funded and part of that. Welcome, all of you. Thank you for being here. Giulio, I'm going to start with you. Could you say a little bit about why you think existing approaches to funding and investment are inadequate to the job of systems change?
Thank you, Charlie. And thank you to the Rockwell Foundation for this and for inviting me. I think I can share some of the questions that really got us into this journey to say, what are the problems that we were encountering? So one of it is that from our perspective anyway, we talk a lot about, complexity and reducing complexity and managing complexity, etc. From our perspective, actually, we need funding models that embrace complexity, that actually acknowledge the complex nature of issues, the systemic nature of issues, and design around that, as opposed to actually trying to simplify them or reduce the risk over time. Now that immediately puts problems because what we tend to do is to project our organizational taxonomy into problems, right? So I have an environment program, I have a governance program, therefore the problem is an environment program or a governance program. Unfortunately, many of the issues that we have to deal with at UNDP don't fit this nice boxes. So that's one big problem. The second thing is the sense of complexity, etc., seems to generate a feeling that decision makers and funders have less options over time, right? It feels overwhelming. Changing a system seems too complex. It's much easier to fund interventions that are more manageable. So the question for us has been, there's such a dominant model which comes from, funneling idea, right? So you have your Dragons Den, your Accelerator program, etc., where you tend to reduce options over time, right? You basically do invest in many things and hope that one of these by miracle becomes the unicorn and will change systems. And at least in our experience, this is not definitely the case. So how do you actually design funding that allows for options to increase over time rather than thinking that you funnel them and you reduce them over time? And this leads to a question which I think is really difficult and we are grappling with, and certainly we are entering conversation with funders who are thinking this way, is how do you design interventions that are not only coherent with the nature of a problem, but also learn from each other over time, as opposed to expect that most of them die out and then some of them scales up all of a sudden. I'll say only maybe the final thing on this point is that the other really difficulty is if you embrace this and if you embrace the fact that, the systems that you're trying to affect, you only really understand them when you start intervening. The effort is much, in a sense, whatever one fantastic effort you do in design, and obviously we need to do it, is going to be superseded by whatever circumstances appear. And so to build institutional will to be able to change and adapt is much more difficult than being institutional will to plan and think ahead of all the risks. And so to be able to dynamically manage that portfolio of interventions and funding them, I think is a big institutional hurdle, certainly for us and also for many of the funders we talked to.
Let me just ask you a couple of things then about that very brilliant synthesis and summary of that. So you're dealing with problems, but also opportunities in a way which are complex. And complex issues have many moving parts. How do you also then build connections between these options so they're not just spread all over the board? And from a funder's point of view, most of the funders that I work with, they're most at ease with, we're going to fund this organization to do this thing, and then we have an accountability and evaluation framework, and we can say whether it's worked or not, and next time we'll do it a bit better. That's a sort of framework of accountability. That's obviously inadequate to that challenge you were talking about, but how do you build a framework of accountability when you're trying to operate in such a complex, evolving space? Because I could imagine boards saying, that sounds great, but what are we going to get out of it?
Yeah. So, welcome to our struggle. This is exactly where we are at the moment. In fact, coming from meetings with monitor and evaluation people on this very topic. And so that's the thing that we're thinking at the moment, right? So our hypothesis is, and this is what we're working on what we call deep demonstrations, so around the world, is that if you actually spend quite a lot of time to design portfolios that are meant to learn from each other. And so that means, in practice, that you actually start spending quite a lot of time to build mental models of how you think the core dynamics in this system are. And you're able then to represent this spatially so that you can start then telling to a funder or to a board and saying, look, the logic of my intervention is this, which means that the learning that we expect to get out of this intervention is that, and this learning accrues over time. And this because we designed with a certain type of coherence in mind, and because we know that no matter how much of that effort, things are going to change, and we need to be able to adapt, what we bring to you is a superior adaptive capacity rather than a superior planning capacity, if you see what I mean. Yeah. And actually, and then bringing in the donors and the funders to say, be with us when we construct the logic, and be with us when we actually try to build that adaptation mechanism. Yeah. And that is really a different type of proposition altogether. It also means, and I conclude, it's not only looking for funding for us, but for looking for a number of many different other organizations that can coalesce around this logic. And that is obviously much more work, and you can see where the resistance is. But anyway, that's our current hypothesis.
Yeah. And I let me bring Alex in here, because I think Alex has been practically trying to do a version of that with his approach to funding in the migration sector in the UK. But before I do, just let me note one thing, that what the importance of what you said about interventions is that you can fund interventions, but you should fund them not just because they might produce a result, but because they're probes almost. They're probes into the dynamics of the system, and they expose things and they create learning, not just for the intervention itself, but for a wider field. And so
yes, and the subtle, sorry, just to say, a subtle difference there, which is a big difference for us culturally, is that when you don't seek funding for solutions, you seek funding for options, right? Positions in this system that allow you to increase your learning over time. It seems as a tiny semantic thing, but actually in terms of mind shift, this is massive, because you're not saying, look, I have a solution to your problem, which obviously is a very difficult pitch to make to someone with a very real problem, but they're actually saying, I'm increasing your options to accelerate the learning about this topic over time. And that's a different pitch altogether.
So Alex, over to you. Just describe to us your approach to the funding that you're undertaking in the migration field in the UK, because you've adopted a very systematic approach to that, which has resisted funding individual organizations for the outcomes that they produce, and is instead really been trying to build a whole field with many different interventions connected. Just tell us what you're doing and why you took that approach.
Sure. Hi, Charlie, and hi, everyone that's joining us today. And just to say, congratulations on what's been a really insightful and interesting week that I've been following vividly over the last few days. I suppose just to start off and say that I think, similar to Giulio, we're very much on a journey with this ourselves, and this approach certainly isn't applied across the whole foundation. I think we're still on a journey ourselves and still kind of exploring this approach. And we do come, I think, from a history of focusing much more on individual projects rather than focusing on the ecosystem. And that itself creates some challenge. Prior to joining the Paul Hamlyn Foundation, I was actually a grantee of the Paul Hamlyn Foundation. And the conversations I used to be having was very much focused on target and output, and not a conversation about the wider system. So just to kind of highlight that we're certainly on a journey with this ourselves. And I suppose my interest in this also comes from being on the other side and trying to shift systems and realizing that our ability to engage with this system was limited by the organization we were in. I think the recognition that no single organization by itself and no single intervention by itself is ever going to achieve the kind of wholesale change that I think I was always interested in. And I think that was part of the motivation for me to join the foundation, was the idea that actually you could start to stitch together different approaches so that they became much more than the sum of their parts. And so that was always a kind of an interest and motivation for me. In terms of the approach, I suppose I've been trying to think it through ahead of this conversation. I think there's 5 or 6 key components to it. And I suppose starting off, systems change is quite difficult to engage with. It can feel intangible, it can feel abstract, and it can feel vague, partly because you're talking about a longer term change. So I think I feel much more comfortable talking about a systems approach. So how do we, and I think there's a very interesting conversation about means and ends. So, the end, of course, is systems change, but I think I focus much more on the means and the systems approach, which I hope will actually achieve the kind of systems change that we're interested in. And so for me, the core components of what I call our systems approach is a focus first and foremost on learning. I think Giulio is absolutely right that actually you're always engaging with the system. And I think it's worth noting that systems are dynamic. They're not static. They're constantly shifting. So you need a learning approach because you need to understand how it's changing, And if you work in a system like the migration system in the UK, it's a system that has seen great volatility and change over the last 10, 20 years. We see a new piece of legislation which creates change in of itself, introduced probably every 1 to 2 years. So you're constantly chasing the system because it's constantly changing. There's a great deal of volatility within that system. So you need to focus on learning so that you can understand the system as it's changing. The second thing I think is that focus on connection. So focus on relationships, and that's the relationship between us and the people we partner with, but also between the partners themselves. So how do you bring people together to really try to understand where there might be clusters or pockets of energy that you can kind of tap into? And your role as, I suppose, as a broker within that, when you're trying to, you recognize opportunities, because the great advantage of being a fund is that you almost have this bird's eye view, and you can spot people who are working towards aligned goals, but perhaps aren't in touch with each other. And there's a great energy that comes with connecting those different parts together. I think the third thing is then focusing on the power of the collective. And I think by that, I mean the fact that there's a real energy that comes when you have different approaches. So you have your research, your policy work, alongside your grassroots activism and your organizing, alongside people who are doing your service delivery. And I think in our approach and the focus on the collective, you give equal weight to all of those approaches.
So just to be clear, Alex, just so people, so when you're looking at the migration system, you're not just looking at services to migrants. You're trying to interact with policy, law, public attitudes, the mainstream system, new service approaches, campaigners, so on and so forth. So in your funding portfolio, going back to Giulio's idea of portfolio and options, you've actually got a very wide array of different people doing different things there. And one of the things that you do is constantly try and bring them together and connect so that their efforts are more than the sum of the parts. It's all not all just distributed all over the sheet.
Yeah, that's right. So I think we do large scale convenings. We bring together everyone that we work with once a year. So that's about 100 or 120 people, all of whom purposely have very different approaches and use very different language to talk about the change that they're trying to achieve. So if you talk to an organizer and how they're trying to achieve change, and they will talk about, shifting power. And then you talk to a researcher, a think tank organization, they're talking about policy, legislation, evaluative systems, and so forth. So part of the brokering is also trying to understand this kind of a common language around change and what the long-term goal is. I think we then do much smaller scale convening. So within that kind of larger ecosystem, and I think one of the exciting things is that once you start to draw that ecosystem, you start to realize who's on the periphery. So whose voices are being kind of sidelined, and how do you bring them much more into the center of the system and much more into the focus of what's driving, what's setting the goal. And I think this really speaks back to the conversation you held yesterday, who's determining what the goal is, who's determining what the approach should be, and making sure that people with direct experience of that system, so in our case, people with direct experience of that immigration system, are very much moved from the periphery right into the center. And they are the ones who are articulating what needs to happen, what should be the approach. And that is then complemented by others within the system. And then the last things I think are about kind of focusing on the long term while also having an eye to the short term too. You need to be able to be responsive
to work between different horizons, yeah.
But actually holding those two horizons it's mutually beneficial, because often, when you're responding to a short-term policy opportunity, part of the response is actually whether that short-term response is successful by highlighting that you can be responsive, that you hold the regard and the view of the person approaching you with that problem highly, and you offer them short-term response. You're actually building the relationship with them. So again, it's means and ends.
So I just want to bring in there then Chrisann, who's been waiting patiently, because Chrisann, you are an example of someone with the kind of lived experience that Alex was talking about, and you've had an experience of being funded by his program. Tell us a bit about what that enabled you to do with the issue that you were particularly concerned with, and how his funding and that approach helped you become a more effective, if you like, systems entrepreneur, changing the system, not just meeting a specific kind of problem.
Thank you, Charlie, and it's really great to be here today. I think how I would start is by I guess, reiterating how I've been better positioned in my career and in my, leadership role at We Belong. And it all started, with that intervention, that specific funding intervention by Paul Hamlin, Alex and the team back in 2014, when I was interacting with the education system and recognized that I couldn't go to university because the government had made a policy change which negatively impacted me. And I felt for a long while that this is beyond my control. I'm interacting with the state here. I am powerless. And like many of the young people that I work with then at Let Us Learn for Equal Access to Higher Education and now at We Belong, I went to an organization with a problem, but through their investment in me as an individual, due to the funding provided, I was able to take control of that situation and become an active participant in helping to resolve my own case. And I've seen personally the transformative impact, not only of myself, but also the organizations I interacted with just by being in the room. So I think the key thing for me in terms of systems change and those who have lived experience is the ability to be directly informed and directly informing those that have the decision-making power, as opposed to having a mediator. So I think what the key question here is, what is the role of civil society and the organizations that are being funded to equip those that are personally impacted? So over the years, recognize that systems change, for it to be accelerated, we must not only engage but also invest in those who have had power taken away from them. Because as you mentioned, people rely on these systems in society, but how do I bring someone from problem to solution in a way that empowers them? And I think the key thing for me here was about resilience being overrated. And I think that that's a key thing, because for resilience almost it shields the community. They find defense mechanisms to cope with entrenched systems and power struggles that constantly go. And the issue with service point delivery and solutions is finding solutions to individual cases, is that you don't look at the overarching system that is in place. And those systems kind of reinforce the socio and economic barriers. And so resilience without engagement and empowerment it is really problematic, because then you have a situation, and this is why direct intentional funding is needed, whereby you're engaging with those people from the community and you're saying to them, actually, we not only want you to be empowered to take ownership of your situation, but the value added to you in society is that in the next phase, if you're interacting with another system, you know what the tools are to directly engage and, I guess, question whether those systems are right, what should be happening.
So just quickly, before we move on, just quickly explain, because people may not have caught it and understood what Let Us Learn did. Because Let Us Learn, was an organization that you created with some people in a similar situation, and you brought about legislative change, an important change in the whole framework for education and people with migrant status. Just tell us what you did, and then what you did after that, because then you went to work in a actual policy setting, didn't you?
Yes, absolutely. So with Let Us Learn, it started with just 3 young people in a room within a charity trying to affect change. And the way in which we really looked at the ecosystem of change, we looked at what is our position in it and what do we have to offer. So at the time, the government had changed a policy which meant that 2,000 young migrants, despite being lawfully resident in the UK, were unable to access student finance. So they were charged international fees as opposed to home fees. And so for a long time, what we did was actually investigate what is the breadth of this issue. Are we the only one? What are the numbers like? So the scope of the issue in the field was really important. But what what we did primarily was to showcase our stories and the impact that, not going into higher education had on us. And for that, we had to interact with lawyers. And I think that, not only because of my legal background, having studied law, but strategic litigation was really important in accelerating the pace of change, because here's this policy where, if presented correctly in court and if the right case studies were there, it could propel change. And so we not only interacted with strategic litigation and barristers and lawyers, but also academics looking at the impact, the long-term impact on society if these young people were unable to go to university. And through that ecosystem of change, interacting with the communities and different actors, what we recognize is that there's a magic here, right? There's a magic in having dialogue with those who are different to you and being given space to occupy. And that kind of led me to the Citizenship and Social Change Initiative at the Greater London Authorities, where I was seconded for a year, and I was able to sit on a team, not only raising the awareness of the impacts, long-term impacts that these policies had on young Londoners, but looking at how to create a dialogue that everyone could agree to.
So that was something I think that Alex helped to fund, which is taking people like you directly into the system. So before we move on, and we're going to bring in some other voices into this conversation, I just want to quickly go to this overhead camera again and just try and sum up where we've got to, and perhaps present a little picture of it, because Giulio started by saying, there's this traditional model here, which is this sort of pipeline. You get a pipeline into a funnel, and out of the end come unicorns. There's a very high rate of wastage in this model, because lots of things fail, but you get this big thing out of the end, and that pays for everything. And this is, as Julia says, is the sort of, this is the classic accelerator model, and everyone has accelerators. Well, let's say that's completely ineffective for systems change, because what we've been hearing is that you need something that looks much more like this. It goes out, and there might be a convener here. It might be Alex, it might be someone else, and you might get ventures out at the end. You might even get system ventures, but you probably also get ideas, you get people, you get maybe minimum viable systems, which are connections. And this is more like a kind of amplifier model. It's going out. And what I sort of heard was that, of course, the key players in the funnel model are entrepreneurs and investors. And that's what you would expect to find in an accelerator. But actually, if you go to one of Alex's convenings, what you find are, you find framework setters who are policymakers. You find visionaries. You find evaluators. You find people with lived experience. You find people who might have access to scaling things. And actually, the population of people who you need in this, you might find public sector commissioners. In other words, the cast of characters is much, much larger. And it's the connections that you make between all these people that starts creating the dynamic of systems change. And each of these in a way might be a learning position, a portfolio, a probe, and it's the way that you bring all these together. And I think that my sense is that when Alex brought Chrisann into that process, Chrisann was able to meet framework setters and connect with commissioners, and they were enabled by their connection to her. And so this, I think, is a completely different model. In the funnel, you just have these guys, you just have entrepreneurs and investors. Those are the only people who count. In this model, you've got a much wider cast of characters. And I think one of the things that I think we're searching for is a way you can do this systematically, at scale, deliberately, collectively. And that's what we're trying to achieve. So without further ado, we are going to show you later the graphic recording that Carlotta is doing. And do remember that there's the Q&A function. But at this point, we're going to bring in a couple of other voices because we're very lucky to have with us a couple of people who are very involved in this kind of work practically, both here in Denmark and in the UK. So I'd like to bring in Emily Bolton, from a partner at Social Finance, and Emily's been practically involved in running systems change, systems innovation incubator programs, looking at complex challenges and trying to work out how to fund systems change for those complex challenges. And Lars Jannick, in his attic in Copenhagen, who runs with other people the Social Innovation Fund in Denmark. So Emily, can I just come to you first, and thoughts, connections, reflections on what you've heard so far?
Thank you, Charlie, and thank you to you and Helena for a fascinating week. Our Slack channel at Social Finance has been full of insights and reflections from your sessions this week. So I think it's just the sort of inspiration we all need at this time. There are lots of things from what Chrisann and Giulio and Alex have said that really resonate with me. And I guess they kind of picked up on a couple of questions, both strategic and tactical. I guess the big strategic question for me is, what does it mean to fund social change rather than social activity? Chrisann talked about the magic that happens when this works. How can funders enable that magic? And then the tactical question that Giulio raised was about how do we use our work and our activity as a locus for learning to enable us to advance our mission? And then there's another question that hasn't been asked, but I think is really pertinent when thinking about funding systems change, which is, how can the money and the funding be used as a lever for widespread change? And so picking up on those, I guess, thinking about how can a funder enable rather than constrain the pursuit of change. Certainly, this is something that we have been working on with funding partners, including Paul Hamlin, over the last 5 years. We set up this initiative called the Impact Incubator that was focused on how do you enable a transformation in some of the most entrenched social issues, and how collaboratively could we come together and really understand the issue with no prejudice as to where the answer lies, and bring together a collaboration of, as you say, the eclectic range of actors that are needed to drive change that can then work to affect long-term change. We've worked in a range of issues, including refugee integration, domestic abuse, young people leaving care, and have launched initiatives that have led to much more widespread change. What I think has been really unique about that funding model from a kind of funding perspective is that funders have funded the process of change, have been a partner on the journey, and have worked with us, recognizing that there's a clear end goal that we care about, but we are working together to work out how to get there, and there isn't a linear path to get there. Thinking about Giulio's point about learning as the locus of work, using the work as a locus for learning, I think that is really powerful. Of course, in any intervention that any of us do, our primary responsibility, of course, is to the people who are receiving that intervention, and we have to ensure that everything that we are doing is to make sure that is as impactful as possible. But taking that as read, there is huge opportunity and power to learn from what's failing today in the system, from the activity that we all undertake. And thinking about the work that we have done around perpetrators of domestic abuse, we started out with an intervention that filled a systemic gap, but actually through the delivery of that intervention have learned about where the other systems failings are, where legislative change is needed, where other systems interventions, so training or expertise or connection is needed. And so your amplifier model hugely resonates there, that you take the work, but that you're not done then. That's your beginning. And then you work out how you learn from it and build from it. Then my final point, which was to add to our list, was how do you use how is funding a lever for change? And I think that sometimes we're all so relieved to get some funding that we're just happy with it. And I don't think that's good enough. And actually, I think those of us on the receiving end of funding should be enabled to ask for what's needed to achieve the change rather than what we think we can get. And secondarily, I think that it's worth looking at the funder, not just as an ATM machine, but to understand their power, their influence, the constraints and flexibility on their money. And so how you can blend the money, as you talked about at the beginning, Charlie, to achieve your systems change goals. And so actually, thinking of this DRIVE program, which is a response to perpetrators of domestic abuse, we blended local authority commissioner money, so it was rooted in the ground, in local delivery, philanthropic money to fund innovation and real management capacity, and central government money to hook it into policy making and long-term policy change. So how can you use money and your funding partners to achieve your wider long-term goals? I've probably overrun my time.
No, that's brilliant, Emily. And that model of layering different kinds of funding together and bringing it together, I think, is very powerful. We should just say that there is Social Finance, I think last week, issued a report about this very innovative systemic program on domestic abuse called DRIVE, which has been very thoroughly evaluated. And it took a completely different approach to domestic abuse and domestic violence. And it's been a very good example of a sort of intervention which delivers a result, but also then has this ripple effect of opening up other things, which we've talked about before. But one important implication of saying we should ask for what's needed rather than just what we can get is that, of course, in the process that Giulio describes, we don't know what's needed yet, because this is a process of learning. So then it comes back to Giulio's point, I think, that you need funders who are committed to the process, and that it could, it's something that will unfold, because you can't say at the beginning, we need this much, because actually it could turn out to be this much. So that sort of sense of the funders being on a journey with people, not just saying, well, we'll give you this now and come back to us when you tell us what you've done. Lars Jannick, I'm going to bring you in now. How's it sound to you, and what are your reflections on all of this?
A lot, but I'll try to be kind of like succinct. I think it's a very, very interesting discussion and a very interesting perspective. And I think den Sociale Kapitalfond, or the Social Capital Fund, we're a social impact fund developer and manager, and we're ourselves, we've been going on for 10 years now, and we're the product of a long-term partnership and backing from Trygfonden, one of the leading Danish charity foundations, that has kind of like made it part of its strategy to help develop the social impact field in Denmark on a systemic level, and we've been sort of like a vehicle for that also. But what I keep with that in mind, so and with bearing in mind that I then de facto now come from the finance side, right? Investment side. In my daily work, I sit in our private equity arm and invest in companies, that are socially inclusive, etc. I have maybe a different perspective, and I hope it's not too much of a curveball. But when we talk about investing in social change on this systemic level, we are mixing apples and oranges in many ways, because it's kind of like a hybrid here. We're using a mindset and a vocabulary, experiences in terms of investing, very often generated also from the private sector, from venture capital, etc. But in my perspective, the kind of innovation we are looking for is much more difficult in the social sector than it is in a private market. The likelihood of making a unicorn you could say, in the private market is very small, and there are very few of these hockey stick companies to invest in. But in my perspective, it's even more difficult in the social sector, because not only do you need to create a hit product, so to say, but you also, the market doesn't regulate itself around it. There'll be the stories we hear also from Chrisann and Alex and so on is also a lot about, having to change the rules of the market for it to adapt your product. So in all these talks about, having the traditional funnels of investing and trying to reverse that, if you were to be the devil's advocate, I'm happy to take on that role in this conversation, you could say, well, to believe that we can reverse the funnel when it's even more difficult to create unicorns, well, the only implication of that, a prerequisite would be that we really believe that there's so much more brilliance among social entrepreneurs than among commercial entrepreneurs. Follow me? That, we need, that the talent pool is even bigger and greater, so that,
Well, I suppose, if we came back to the overhead camera at this point, which is still pointing at this amplifier model, I suppose one way to say it would be, there are entrepreneurs, but there are many other people who need to be involved in this process here. It's not just an entrepreneurial process, and it's the question of how you bring them together. But I do think, if we can cut back off that now, I do think this question that you raised, Lars Jannick, which is, what if, which I think is what Chrisann was in, as you say, was involved in, what if you have to try and change the rules of the game in order for your venture to be successful, because the context into which you're pitching yourself is inimical to your success, and who invests in that? Because if that's really important to invest in, then you can have any number of projects coming out, but they just hit the wall because the rules of the game have been against them. So at this point,
can I just add? Sorry, yeah, because no, I agree with you, and my point is not just to be provocative, but to say that I absolutely follow you and the points of also Chrisann and Alex that assuming that even though there's lots of brilliance, the level of brilliance is not that high. The importance of having funders investing in also all these intermediaries, so to say, all the facilitators is super important. So I think there's a point which I also get from your presentations, Chrisann and Alex, about that at the end of the day, doesn't this mean that we actually need to make higher demands for funders in this field, so to say, more sophisticated, more long-term, a true venture mindset, actually, for this to be successful. And then you can ask the question to you if you think the funders are there. And this is where I would actually end. Yeah.
So I'm going to, in a second, we need to bring Jenny in, who's bursting with questions from the Q&A. But I can see that both Alex, Chrisann, you've got things quickly to say about what Lars Jannick has just said. So very brief.
I'm happy to go first. I think that from my perspective, the role of the funder needs to be really proactive and also relational. I think the convenings that Paul Hamlin have done a lot to change the mindset of the sector in itself, where the migration sector is normally through the tradition model, you are here to be helped and we're going to help you get from point A to point B. And it's the section in the middle that they're not really investing in, because perhaps there's a culture within the sector that there's a level of seniority when it comes to occupying a specific space or being a part of certain conversations. And so I think where there is a desire on the part of the funders to encourage organizations and grantees that they work with to collaborate. Once it's been said from the head, who holds the purse strings, it really does send shockwaves throughout the sector that something needs to change. And I think the second thing I would say is that funders also need to look not only at the entrepreneurial spirit of those working on projects, but how do you create a spin-off organization if the current structure in the existing charity, for example, or migration sector isn't befitting sitting, how do you encourage those entrepreneurs coming out to spin out and intentionally design governance structures and intentionally design systems change approaches that you know can be beneficial?
Because basically Let Us Learn started with this education thing, and then out of that learning, you created We Belong, which is the first organization created and run by migrants and young migrants and refugees in the UK. And that's a sort of process of evolution and learning. Alex, very quickly, and then we'll come to the questions.
Thanks, Charlie. Three really quick points, but I think Lars and Emily's contributions are incredibly helpful. But first off, to say, of course, we're trying to change the rules of the game. The reason why we're all interested in systems changes is because there's a deep dissatisfaction with the way the game is being played and who's allowed to be part of the game and who's not allowed to be part of the game. So, of course, we're interested in shifting the rules of the game. That's the whole point of systems change. And I think that's why you don't only focus on the unicorns. You know the market's not ready to adapt it. So you're trying to intervene strategically in the actual marketplace because the market's dysfunctional, I suppose. So just to state that at the beginning. And I think the second point is that I think perhaps we're presenting these two things as kind of a distinct and binary choice, but actually we have multiple bilateral relationships with organizations. And, you know, so you start off with a conversation often about a problem and what an organization wants to do about that problem. But then you're layering that conversation on top of your broader kind of amplifier funnel opening out. So, you know, you are having this discrete conversations about problems, but then you're stitching it all together. And hopefully by stitching it together, people's view is kind of opening. I don't think it's one or the other. You're using your learning and your intelligence from the wider funnel to inform some of these smaller conversations which are focused on the problem. And then you're then bringing them back into that kind of bigger funnel. And then the third thing, just to say very quickly, is that, of course, this makes a much greater demand of funders. Lars, you're absolutely right, because I think sometimes where we really trip up is that we say we want to do all of these things. We want organizations to be agile. We want them to learn. And then we give them a measly amount of funding that doesn't even cover half a salary post of somebody who's trying to do something. So how do you fund in a way that increases the health of the ecosystem and doesn't undermine it? So how do you kind of fund those behaviors? Of course, you don't know how much you need to fund, but you can certainly fund in a way that allows organizations to have proper systems in place to learn, that allows them to look after the health of their staff, that if you're convening, you resource them to come to that convening so that it's not an additional burden of their time. It makes a much greater demand of funders, but if that's what you want to do, then you have to make sure your resources match your intent.
Yeah, so, and I just want to add, before we come to Jenny, one further implication of that, which Alex won't have mentioned, is that you have to say no to then quite a lot of things, because there are really good organizations that come to you and say, I've got a great intervention, will you fund it? And actually, because it's not playing a role in learning and feeding the wider ecosystem, you have to say no. So there is a choice being made by Alex and those funders to not fund some things which might seem very attractive. We've cut into the time for questions from the floor, as it were. So I'm going to go over to Jenny now to bring those in.
Great, thanks, Charlie. So there is a lot of interest from our audience who are listening in the idea of convening people differently to fund this ecosystem. So the first question is to Chrisann, actually. So given your perspective from what you've seen as being part of this process, and obviously you've had a very enlightened funder that you've been working with, but who should have the ability or the power to convene? What would it look like if it wasn't a funder, but someone from a different part of the system who was playing that convening role? Could that still have the same effect or better effect? What do you think?
I think it really depends on the arena. So that the conversations that follow as a result of funders convening are open and honest conversations within the sector. But then obviously that's another silo, right? We want to engage with the other silos in the system. And so on one aspect, I think there needs to be convening done by funders so that we can have a sector-wide conversation on what needs to change. And that can really provide opportunities for us to see the synergies and really collaborate to prevent duplication of work, to ensure that we're not all funded to do the same thing, but just different, different specific changes within that ecosystem. The second thing I think is really important, and this is the work that we do at We Belong, is engaging with policymakers, and not necessarily on their terms, but on our terms. And so a lot of the times when we look at power and how it is within society, if we want to engage with the immigration system, we're always doing it on their terms and their basis, where they open up an inquiry where something's gone horribly wrong, and instead of incremental changes, they just see, compartmentalize the changes. For example, they look at this specific section, make one very narrow change, and then don't open it up. But what we've decided to do in creating an open dialogue is to have one-to-one conversations over time with policymakers, closed off, away from the public arena, and it's not campaign or advocacy related, but it's about building a relationship. And through that, we then, as an organization, develop our own platforms for them to engage with us on our own basis. So since 2017, we've been hosting our own parliamentary events where we host different, around a specific topic or an issue, host different policymakers and ensure that, they know the terms of engagement here. So it's not limited, it's much broader, and they have a diverse pool of people to interact with that they've never had to interact with before.
Great, thank you, Chrisann. So that actually leads into the next question, which is for Alex, which is a question coming from Simon. What do you think the connection is between your grant making and your convening role? To what extent could you achieve that system shifting aim by just doing the convening? Or do you feel that there are overlooked activities that actually would not get funded unless you were taking that convening perspective?
It's a really good question. I see them as completely interrelated, and I think it comes back to that point about learning. Our ability to learn is predicated on us funding organizations to do work from which they are learning, because I'm not learning directly from the work, I'm learning from them. So, that going back to that point of layering, that when we are having a conversation about organizations within which, we're making choices about who we should fund, we're doing a few different things. We're first of all looking at everyone in our portfolio, and we're identifying where are the gaps in the portfolio. We're then overlaying that with an analysis of the context. So how is the context changing? And then what does that mean for the gaps that we have within our portfolio? So where should we be kind of channeling resources? And then the third layer is then what are we learning from the organizations we're partnering with? And that is then informing the decisions we're making. But our ability to learn doesn't just come from our bilateral relationships when people we have a conversation about activity and what people are doing. It comes from that washing machine, from everyone coming in, but also bringing in other perspectives. And that's kind of giving us intelligence, which is then informing our grant making, decision making too. So I see them as completely interwoven with one another.
Great, thank you, Alex. And to finish off, 2 questions for Giulio, actually. So Giulio, we know that when people are creating these system shifting type ventures, they've got these 2 jobs to do because they're trying to generate demand for a new way of operating at the same time as meeting what is there in the system. So how do you manage that sort of chicken and egg nature of it? Are you tracking how well they're opening up what you might call, you've called those options in the system? Or how are you thinking about that? And the second question that we have is about private capital, private wealth. So if we think that there's a limit to how much we can rely on government investment at this particular time, do you see private wealth and the behaviours around private wealth changing? Is there a role that they can play in this that you're starting to see emerge, or what do you think is happening in that part of the field?
Thank you. So on the first question, it's interesting because we are at the beginning of our journey, right? So we are exactly in this process where I go back to my colleagues and the programs that we are funding, etc., and say we need to build demand and supply at the same time. And this doesn't buy me many friends, right? Just to say, for example, so I think I should mention this is a sponsor ad, but you know, the big shift that we are making at this moment is actually funded by the Danish government, right? And when we went to them and said, look, we want to move from funding single point solutions and small scale experiments, etc., to this type of portfolio approaches, they said, go for it. Right, and I was, I had all my slides and say, "Why we still have here?" It's no, this makes sense. Go, right? Which was brilliant, right? But obviously, this is once in a lifetime. But I would also say, this is not about organizations; it's about individuals and champions within individuals. And I guess Alex represents one of them in that sense, right? So it's not monoliths. So next week we actually have brought together some of these early champions in donor governments that are starting to talk, and they are in the same painful situation as I am internally, having to persuade their own systems there's a different way of doing this. And then you start creating, if anything, a wailing wall, and then hopefully a little bit of movement, right, in that sense. So there is, this is what we're trying to do right now, and trying to see who are the individuals who are starting to talk a different type of language, who are seem to be opening up spaces, and then starting reflecting this back to the organization and say, look, if they're saying that they're doing it, if donors are interested, well, surely we can provide them a set of bankable propositions, right? Investments, if you want to call it that way. So that's a little bit where we are at the moment. I'm pretty sure that Chrisann or Alex have much better ideas on this topic. On the private sector, I have to say that's an interesting question, because this, again, we are way too early to see this, but interestingly enough, one thing that was very unexpected for me, when we started to talk about some of its logics, we got interest for some people in the private sector, which we were not expecting. So we were doing a project on waste, where we basically went in and said, look, everybody wanted to do recycling. It's a massive problem across Asia. And we said, well, you know what? If you only do recycling, you're only intervening in a very small part of the system. And actually, you might actually exacerbate the problem, because in many places there's no recycling processing plants, right? And so we actually said, no, you need to think about the whole system and intervene many different type of players, including, for example, informal waste pickers, and reducing production of plastic up front. So you go to the manufacturers, etc. And we thought this was not necessarily a very popular proposition, but actually private sector funders started to come in on this particular logic, which brings me back a little bit to a point that I think Chrisann are making and Alex were making about this relational thing, right? So when you open up a logic of what you're trying to think and saying why operating in this different type of logic is likely to get different type of results, or at least this is your working hypothesis, and you enter in a conversation on that, that's also where the process of layering starts to begin, because private sector people, well, actually we have a very different type of perspective on this. Let me tell you how this works from our side. And when you start really building, the logic, testing the logic of your intervention much more, and I think this gets quite exciting. But it's very, very early days for us, for sure.
So thank you very much indeed for all of that. That's been a really fascinating discussion. Emily, Lars, Alex, Giulio, Chrisann, thank you for being with us. People have really enjoyed it. If you want more detail, we have detailed video recordings of interviews we've done with Giulio and with Alex and Chrisann. So after this, if you want to go back to those, they're on the platform. You can dip back into those, and there are links to their work. But at this stage, let's go back to another poll and see what people have been making of all of this as we've gone along. So we'll bring up this final poll. I think, Anton, yeah, there we go. And you've got, it's quite a complex poll, I think. I think we got slightly carried away, and we got 3 questions, so I'm going to give you 30 seconds to answer it. Do you have clearer ideas about why investing in systems innovation requires innovation itself? What's the most important contribution of a system shifting funder? And would you be interested in engaging more on this topic? We're certainly really interested in trying to create more of a systemic conversation, which, as everyone has said, could bring in private funders, philanthropic capital, public funders, to create some sort of easier way for this layering to take place, the kind of combination that Emily was talking about earlier. And I certainly have found a growing interest amongst private funders of different kinds, as Giulio mentions, to think big, because actually systems are big market opportunities as well. And interestingly, some people I know are very involved in thinking about new systems for energy and what have you in Africa, where there is the emergence of new solar-based systems, which create all sorts of opportunities. So I think that's a really interesting combination. But what's absolutely clear is it's not one kind of capital. So we've almost got 2/3. You've got 10 seconds left to vote, to register your vote. There's obviously 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We're going to close it there. So people have found it very helpful. So that's great. We've done a job for people. There's the important thing is having a longer term horizon, being able to stick with it, I suppose, and this ability also to convene. So if you think about shifting systems as creating long-term coalitions for change, I suppose that's what that might mean. And would you be interested in engaging more? 96%. So that shows there's a real appetite for this. So I think that's really important. I'm not going to do very much to sum up because we're almost out of time. We'll bring back our graphic recording in a second. Here it is. Here's what Carlotta has been working at over the bridge. And she's conveying a whole set of ideas there, which you'll be able to dip into. I just want to reiterate, I suppose, a couple of things. One is the importance of thinking also about disinvestment as a lever for change, to stop investing in things. And the second is just to note from my own experience, I suppose, of Alex's funding, that Alex and what Alex has done with the Shared Ground Fund is a fantastic combination of the brilliance of the sort of free radicals like Chrisann, who come in with lived experience and really animate the system and everything they touch. Chrisann really animates rather dead seeming systems by her energy, ideas, and all the rest of it. And that takes a sort of ability to spot and back that kind of thing. It's almost like backing an artist. But at the same time, and I don't know if we can come back to the overhead view at this point, the overhead view of this amplifier model. At the same time, whilst Alex is convening these things, and there are lots of different players, it's worth bearing in mind, this is going to be very crude, that he also makes some very big bets. And there are some very big bets on research, or for instance, on justice. And so it's about learning in time and then bringing people together around some of these things and creating more of a kind of cluster. And that kind of complementary investment is where you get long-term change. So it's about doing small things and connecting all sorts of things, but it's also about making big and long-term bets. So without further ado, I will call it a day there. I will hand over to our host, Helena, to see us out. And we have a Padlet, which is a bulletin board for you to continue to contribute your questions and thoughts, should you wish to do so. The link to the Padlet is in the chat now. This afternoon, we've got a brilliant discussion with Anna Fjellsted and Jenny Winhall about bringing systems change to frontline workers. That starts at 3 o'clock Central European time. Helena, I've left you no time at all, I'm afraid, to wish us goodbye.
I'll try to do it very quick. Thank you all, Chrisann, Giulio, Lars, Alex, and Emily. It's been great. And I think what's actually most, what I sit with most here is we're not talking about investing in just social problems. We're actually talking about investing in how to solve really, really complex issues, social challenges that we haven't been able to solve for decades. And that type of investment clearly needs something else. And I like how you're saying that you're on a journey of exploration and how to do it. And also how, I think it was Giulio that put it, we actually need to build superior adaptive capacity and go away from the superior planning capacity that we may have at the moment. And I think that in many ways was a good way of explaining the shift from the accelerator model and into the amplifier model that you're talking about. Thank you all. It's been a great learning session today again. And back to Charlie's candle.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for joining us in Copenhagen. I'm going to blow the candle out and end the session, but do come back this afternoon if you can. Thank you.